the CNN poll, and more importantly, the controversy around the CNN poll. And for those of you who don't know, I remember watching CNN this week, and they talked about how things, um, look bleak for Biden because his poll numbers show him losing to Nikki Haley, right? But we found out that there was an oversampling. About 60% of poll respondents were Republicans. Now, there are some people who are expert in polls who are coming back and saying, hey, that's how they do polls overall. But even if that's how they do over polls and overall, to me, I'm not sure what you think. It does feel like what we've talked about week after week is some of this polls that it seems like it's more of a manipulation tactic than a legitimate tactic. And now we understand that there are some um, fundamental things that they do in polls that the general public doesn't understand, and sometimes an oversample is addressed. But what was your reaction this week? One, to the initial the poll, and then two, once we found out that the Republicans were oversampled.
Yeah, I think I might have put it on the prep. If I didn't, that's my bad. The poll was like the biggest kind of news this week. I think you're onto something. Well, I don't know if they're saying oversampling is just common poll practice, and you oversample on one side and the other side and kind of put it together, sort of situation. But the problem is they're not saying that, right? CNN is reporting it as it's the crater coming to Earth and it's the end of the world for Biden. They're not saying 60% of Republicans think Biden, it's a 50-50 split. Also, all right, let's go to South Carolina. Let's go to California. Let's go to New York and Chicago and poll 70% of the people. And let's see what those polls say, right? Because it's not going to be 50-50. So that's what's troubling to me, John. Like, I know everybody took it how they took it, and I agree. The polls are skewed. But what's interesting is it was a 50-50 split, and it was 60% Republicans. That's horrible news for Donald Trump. Horrible news for Republicans. If Biden's a 50-50 split amongst those 60% of Republicans, that's how the poll was, then that's not what the country is. The country isn't 60% Republican. So I would read that as horrible news if I was a Republican. And the idea of polls, and I know I'm you call me the pollster and everything. I'm so interested in it. Ever since 18, the pollsters will say we weren't wrong, because they'll say it's 51-49 with a margin of 3 error. Just the margin keeps coming into play, right, John? So they're saying there's a back door here. We're giving ourselves a little disclaimer that this could be off by 3 or 4 points, and it just keeps continuing to be off by 3 or 4 points. I suspect that'll be the case here too. And I'm not, look, we shouldn't count our chickens and we shouldn't start celebrating or popping the champagne, but any poll that says Biden 50-50 amongst Republicans, I'll take that as a +5 amongst the country. You know what I mean? That's how I see it personally. The polls, I think, not to get super nerdy here, but we'll go a sports analogy. You ever see a Hall of Fame pitcher in the majors? Like, nobody could hit him, Kershaw, Maddox, whatever, right? And he goes to the minor leagues and he just gets absolutely rocked. Like, he gets hurt and they rehab him in the minors and he just keeps getting rocked in the minors. I thought that was the silliest thing to me until I realized what they're doing is Greg Maddux might go to the minors and say, I want to work on my fastball today, and he'll throw 50 straight fastballs. He's not pitching. He's just trying to work on his game. And that's why he gets rocked, because they know the fastballs are coming. But it doesn't matter to Maddux, right? Because he's just trying to work on his craft. I think that's what the polls are, is they are trying to accomplish a 50-50 split, and they're skewing the questions, they're skewing the sampling to make that happen. Does that make sense, John? It's not like they're sampling and then how the poll results lie, they lie. They're trying to make it 50-50, and so they ask certain questions. Some of the questions they ask, John, is if Biden was sick, what would you vote for? And they would be like, I'd be unsure because Biden's sick. But then the poll comes out and it's like, people are unsure if Biden, you know what I mean? It skews it so much. Some of the questions are so not biased, but they're so pointed that you have no choice but to make it a 50-50 split. I bet you if you just put on Twitter and you put on Facebook a poll of who you're voting for, I think Biden would probably run away with that in just a basic poll.
Well, but here's something else to consider that I really don't think people realize with polls and polling. And the press doesn't even do this. Um, it's weird because when we say ignore the polls, that is 50-50 true. What we don't like is that the polls, those of us who work in politics, we don't like how polls drive the news cycle because they are become scare polls. They become very easy to manipulate and to like advance a frame. But here's the other thing, though, that the press doesn't want to acknowledge about polls. The polls, and I think every campaign, even the campaigns that dismiss particular polls, they take all the polls seriously. And polls, the reason why we a lot of times campaign in polls is we want to see what messages are working for us, what our vulnerabilities are, what our opportunities are. So any kind of um, legitimate political consultant strategist is looking at that polls. They may first of all dismiss it, but more importantly, they're going to look at the crosstabs. They're going to look at what it says, and if there's some truth to those polls, they'll be able to say, "Oh, it's kind of going back to sports analogy. It's like game film to a certain extent, right? Is you put polls? We put polls out there. I have a mailer, a mail." Guy that I use to send out direct mail for the candidates I work with, and he won't even send out any direct mail without doing polls. And the polls may tell us different information, but then what the polls tell us to is, okay, this candidate needs more name recognition. This candidate needs to compare and contrast. These are the issues that are important. So the thing is, I do think that I'm I'm unhappy with the way that the press uses polls to drive the narrative. But I also don't want people to understand that if any campaign is getting back or looking at polls, either their own polls or third party polls, they're looking at all the data and they're not really saying, especially over a year out, they're not saying, "Oh crap, we're going to lose." They're looking and saying, "Okay, this is a very interesting question here. What do we do in this particular situation?" And oftentimes, too, when these big polls, these media polls go out, the campaigns themselves do polling to actually address and answer certain questions. You've all heard, those of you who watch cable news or listen to a lot of, read or listen to a lot of political media, understand that there's a phrase called internals. What does the internal polling say? Right? The internals are the stuff that we do within polls that we don't within campaigns that we don't share with the general public. But it's great for there to be a poll and then CNN has a panel discussion. Everybody's like, "Oh, Biden's in trouble," but you're being manipulated. You're being manipulated. One, with how the poll is conducted, but two, the reality is every poll, the media treats every poll like it's an election, not realizing these are things. And as we said, I liked what you said about the whole thing about sending pitchers down to the minor leagues. It literally allows the campaigns to look, observe, and correct, address, and also say, well, that's kind of BS, or it's legitimate here. So if we're really concerned about Nikki Haley getting more votes to Biden, then the Biden campaign are like, okay, if Nikki Haley is going to be our opponent, they're going to do some internal polls to figure out how do you attack and take down Nikki Haley.
100%, John. This is a fascinating conversation to me because I think everyone kind of starting to see through it now. And like you said, if you're internal, there's information for you in the poll. But to generalize it, I think it's just inaccurate. But here's what I will say: big picture things. Good. I am glad that the polls and CNN is saying it's a 50-50 split between Biden and Trump because I prefer that over what will happen to Hillary in 2016. Because I personally, I can't speak for everybody, but it's pretty clear that everybody thought it was in the bag. I thought Hillary was on to a historic victory, and we took our foot off the pedal. So I'm kind of glad that we are still the underdogs. I'm kind of glad that they put a chip on our shoulder to say, all right, if it's 50-50, then let's show up and let's make sure we show up. Because I believe, and we've known this for a long time, it's just if Democrats show up, we win elections. And the only time we kind of really get in a bad spot is when we don't show up. The only reason Hillary lost was because of voter turnout. It wasn't because she had the popular vote. She would have won Michigan in a blowout. She would have won Pennsylvania. People just thought it was safe and they voted for Harambe or they voted for Trump as a joke or they voted for, whoever, their mom. And I think that's gone. I think that is done with. So I'm keep the polls coming. I prefer that over anything else. because let's just stay on it because we keep winning. And I don't know if you saw Ronald Clay this week. He went full Dark Brandon on everybody. And now that he's not the chief of staff, he's kind of saying, "What are you guys talking about?" Yeah, he's the only guy to beat Trump. He's the only person to ever beat Trump. And you guys think he's bad right now? He's going to blow him out again. That's what he said. So I just love that energy because I think internally we feel good. And let's just keep the pressure on everybody else.